Well, welcome all you wiretappers out there back here in the studio of Gangland Wire for part two of Crooked City, Youngstown, Ohio with Johnny Cetchelli. Welcome, Johnny.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for having me back.
Well, I'm really glad you got hold of me about this because I think I've mentioned before, I wanted to do something on Youngstown for a long time, and I don't just get distracted by John Gotti half the time, as we all do. And so I'm really glad you guys did this podcast because I've learned a lot by listening to it. And Crooked City, Youngstown, Ohio, it's a great podcast, guys. When you're not listening to Gangland Wire, and I know everybody listens to way more than one podcast, I sure do. So check that Crooked City, Youngstown, Ohio out. And we have one of the producers here on it who was involved in the making of it and is from Youngstown, Ohio, correct, Johnny?
Mm-hmm. Yep,
and knows the mob history of Youngstown, Ohio, like I know the mob history of Kansas City, probably even better if he's going back to the olden days. Because, in the last episode, we talked about the olden days or pre the 70s, say when Youngstown started going downhill, when it became the poster child for the Rust Belt cities as unemployment skyrocketed and the steel mills shut down, and the steel mills were about the only industry, the only decent jobs they had in Youngstown. Is that right, Johnny?
Yeah, the steel mills it was a one-horse town for sure. So the steel industry was it. And, when it went under, they lost 50,000 jobs. My grandfather and my father were steel workers, right?
Yeah.
So we went back a little further. I actually just found out this week that my great-grandfather, who was a West Virginia hillbilly Italian, he came to West Virginia right off the boat, became a coal miner. He was convicted in 1923 of violating the National Prohibition Act.
Yeah, guess what for? Bootlegging.
He made the Dago red wine. They all love it.
Yes, there's a lot of that made back in those days. I was in a basement of an old house, and the great-granddaughter of the original people that came over from Sicily, actually, they had a concrete vat made in the basement of this house, poured in the basement. And that's where they made the wine, in the basement. And they had a tunnel underneath the street to their sister brother's house across the street. So they would make it. They had a storage room, and then they would take it through the tunnel to the other house, and they could take it out through the other house. So it's quite a history there.
Yeah. And, my great grandfather went on from, he was a coal miner, and his sons came to Youngstown because there was a promise of jobs. There were all these steel mills that needed workers, and it was a big immigrant town. And so Italians were welcome. Huge Italian population, even to this day in Mahoning County, Ohio. I read a statistic that was outside of what they considered the Northeast, New York and New England. It has the highest per capita population of Italians anywhere west of that.
I'll be darned.
It's right here in Youngstown, Ohio.
Interesting. And when the Italians, especially from southern Italy and Sicily, when they came back in the turn of the century, they brought the Black Hand with them. There was a few of them that were the Black Hand, which was, it was really part of survival over in Sicily against the, shall we say, the northern oppressors at one time how it got started. But they brought that with them, and that's that tradition just continued on until modern times. So this week, we're going to get on into modern times and talk about this huge character, the Sheriff Jimmy Traficant, and we're going to get into Lenny Strollo a little bit, who was a more modern day boss of Youngstown, and more of a traditional mafia kind of a boss. So, Johnny, where do you want to start? You want to start with Jim Traficant?
I think we got to start with Jimbo. Yeah.
Okay.
Just because that's what we're just talking about. The steel industry in Youngstown collapses at the end of the 70s. Black Monday, 1977. Youngstown Sheet and Tube announces they're shutting down suddenly, laying everybody off. It's the first of many steel mills that close very quickly. There's a big change coming to Youngstown that it's not prepared for. So thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of laid off steel workers are angry. Unfortunately, this affects the mob as well, because suddenly there's not as much money to go around in Youngstown. These guys aren't spending it on the vices. So that in effect triggers a little mob war, as we talked about in the last episode, for control of the scraps, what's left. At this time, there was a guy who seized a political opportunity that would really change the face of Youngstown for a few decades. His name was James Traficant. His family he was Italian. Obviously, he was a Traficante that was shortened to just Traficant. He was the self-proclaimed son of a truck driver. He was a big football hero. People called him Jimbo when he was younger. So that was a nickname that kind of stuck. And if you say it around Youngstown, you'll get an affectionate response. If you say anything, good about old Jimbo. Jim was a quarterback of the famous Youngstown school here, Cardinal Mooney, which becomes later on known for all these coaches, the Stoops brothers, who coach, Oklahoma and Kentucky, the Pellinis. Those are Coach Boom Boom Mancini, some famous athletes and sports guys, the DeBartolos, who own the 49ers. They're all of this Cardinal Mooney, this Catholic high school in Youngstown. James Traficant was the first graduating class, 1959. He was the star quarterback for the football team. He gets a scholarship and goes to Pitt. He plays as quarterback for a few years at Pitt with guys like Mike Ditka. Okay, he was the quarterback who was kind of uncoachable. He was always getting benched because he was getting in fights with his head coach. Against all of this, he still gets drafted in the NFL by the Pittsburgh Steelers. And it doesn't work out with the Steelers, who are about to have a phenomenal run there. This is, going into the 70s. It doesn't work out there. He gets a tryout with the Oakland Raiders and almost makes it, and doesn't end up making it. So what does he do? He comes back to Youngstown, and he gets into politics, of all things. People love Jim. He could really win anyone over that he met. That was he was just gifted as a politician. Very personal politics, things that he'd shake your hand and tell you about your mother and your father and your grandfather, and give you a whole family history of yourself. He knew people in the town, and they knew him. And so he used that to run for office. He ran for sheriff. This is after a few years he'd gotten a master's degree. Very smart guy. He was a drug counselor for a few years before that. He kind of ran the methadone clinic, right? Getting people off the street and organizing people, and was while he was getting a master's degree, that's what he was doing. And he started working on people's campaigns and got into politics, and eventually ran for sheriff in 1980. And in Youngstown, as we talked about in the last episode, going back to the 1940s, the public here expects you to take money when you run for office. So it should have been known that he was going to be approached or, compromised in some degree with the mob here in town. The guys at this time, I told you they were kind of battling for turf. Cleveland guys and Pittsburgh guys. The Carabias out of Cleveland, Joey Naples, and Briar Hill Jimmy Prado with the Pittsburgh families. Lenny Strollo was part of that group as well. It through some just fantastic luck, and a couple, and the effects of this mob war, the FBI gets their hands on some tapes. Okay, this is later in 1980. They get their hands on these tapes while they're searching an apartment of a missing mobster. they find these cassette tapes in a bread box. They call them the bread box tapes. We talked to the FBI agent who found them, Bob Croner. He's a big part of Crooked City. If you listen to Crooked City, he's a big voice in that show. He tells the story of how he found those tapes and what was on them. And what was on them was Jim Traficant talking to two of the Carabia brothers about the money that they gave him. Not only that, but the money that Joey Naples gave him and Briar Hill Jimmy Prado. So this tape was actually made by the Carabias. They taped him as insurance in a way. You know, this guy, they didn't know if they could control this guy. You know, he was kind of a loose cannon, very big personality. And so they taped their own conversation. One of them goes missing. A hitman for him goes missing. These tapes come up. Now, suddenly, the FBI calls Jim Traficant into their office. And at this point, he's won the election. So I'll go back a little bit. On these tapes, he openly talks about $163,000 in contributions to his campaign for sheriff. The majority of it, there was 60 of it came from the Carabias. The 100,000 came from the Pittsburgh side, Joey Naples and Jimmy Prado. And in it, he says some pretty inflammatory stuff on these tapes, and how if these tapes ever, or if anything were to happen and he were to get arrested for taking these bribes, he would say that he was doing a one-man sting operation and going to take down the mob. When he says this on the tapes,
that's a good one.
when he says this on the tapes, the mobsters laugh. They tell him it's a good one. They tell him he's crazy. So, of course, these tapes come out. The FBI gets a hold of them, and they bring him in. And Bob Croner talks this whole story. I don't want to ruin too much of it. You can check it out on Crooked City. But, you know, he talks about how they brought him in. They played the tapes. He denied everything until they played the tapes. And then suddenly he was defeated. And he, according to them, he agreed to sign a confession. And they wrote it up, and all they did was slide it in front of him and for him to sign it, and he signed it, okay. And the thinking was that he was going to cooperate with them to maybe take down both sides of the mob. Unfortunately, the FBI quickly learned Jim was never going to cooperate with them, and so as soon as he left that meeting, he had made his own strategy and his own game plan, and. It's truly unbelievable what happens after that. He says he goes to the public, goes on TV, says, I didn't do any of this. It was, I couldn't trust any of these other corrupt cops or officials or anybody. And he, to a degree, he had a point.
Yeah, he did.
At that point, we didn't get in much of it, but the guy who ran the FBI in town for 20 years was on Joey Naples' payroll. So, and he, by the time Traficant becomes sheriff in 1980, that guy I just mentioned, Stanley Peterson, the FBI agent of 20 years, was now the chief of police in Youngstown. And he was on the payroll of the mob.
Oh my God.
It's really insane. It really is
insane.
And so he, to a certain degree, he wasn't lying when he said he couldn't trust any of these. He didn't trust the FBI. He didn't trust anybody. He didn't trust any of these guys. So he essentially, they charge him, they indict him, and they, have all this mountain of evidence against him. And he takes them, he says, bring it on. And he defends himself. He's not a lawyer. He defends himself pro se in court, and against these charges of racketeering and bribery, these federal charges. They play the tapes, they show the confession, all of that, and he wins the case. It's not a hung jury. He's acquitted.
He's acquitted. Wow.
And that's all detailed in Crooked City. We talked to one of the jurors who
really?
Oh, real, just, we break it down really well in Crooked City. And it's, just a fascinating look at that trial and that case. And as soon as he wins, and I'm leaving so much of the juicy stuff out, the real fun details, I should go back and think that I need to describe what Jim Traficant looks like now for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Big guy, college quarterback. Okay. Now it's 15 years removed from his playing days, or 10, maybe 10 years removed from his playing days. He's got a toupee on top of his head. In 1980, it was just a small one, and it grows over the decades. But
of course.
These long sideburns, glasses. He wore clothes that he wore like this old blazer that had holes in it and was just tattered. He wore bell-bottom pants and cowboy boots. And that was what the jury saw, as opposed to the three-piece suit of the FBI's prosecutor.
Yeah.
And the FBI guys that were also sitting at the table in their nice suits. He really played it as, I'm one of you, I'm a man of the people, and these guys are coming after me. Keep in mind, he's still the sheriff. Okay. So what he's doing at this time, right before the trial starts, he campaigned on getting drugs off the street. He had this background as a drug counselor. He was going to get drugs off the street. So he goes on this mission, this publicity tour, basically, before the trial starts, where he starts busting drug dealers.
Oh, yeah. Now's the time for a big drug bust and getting money and guns on the table. Boy, that now is the time.
Oh, there's pictures of him with these giant, machine guns and the whole nine. But an even more stroke of genius, what he did as the sheriff, it was his job to post the notices of eviction.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And evict these laid off steelworkers. And he saw the news cameras there at his dereliction of duty trial. He got brought before a local judge, and the judge said, "Will you sign these deeds?" And he knows that the camera's rolling on the news camera, and he goes into this big tirade about how he won't do it, and you're going to have to throw him in jail. And so he goes and spends 3 days in the Mahoning County Jail as the sheriff. They handcuff him, take him away. And even though he does eventually sign them 3 days later, he got all the publicity off of it.
Yeah. And
became cemented in that moment that this guy cares about the steelworkers, about the town.
Mm-hmm.
He's one of us.
Yeah.
And so what he did in this trial was he convinced the judge very early on. They did it in Cleveland, okay, at a federal courthouse in Cleveland, which is an hour away. Youngstown, as we talked about last time, it's an hour away from Cleveland. It's an hour away from Pittsburgh in different directions. So they had the trial in Cleveland, but he convinced the judge to allow half of the jury, 6 members of the jury, to come from Youngstown. He said, I want to be, a jury of my peers.
Right.
And you've got to be from Youngstown. He said, Cleveland's close, but you've got to be from Youngstown to understand Youngstown. Mm-hmm. And the people in Youngstown, maybe more so than any other city like it, mob-infested city, the people of Youngstown knew the mobsters in town. Mm-hmm. People then could tell you who was the boss, okay, on the street. These, they knew these guys. So they understood how the town was corrupt, and how things that he was saying, I can't trust these other cops or these FBI or whatever. They knew that there was some truth to it. So even though they had a tape where he spells everything out in great detail about the money he took from both sides, who and all that, even though they had the confession, even though they had the testimony of these FBI agents who did the case, Jim was still acquitted.
Mhm.
And he told the jurors, if you stick by me like a junkyard dog in the face of a hurricane, that was the saying that he did that became a big famous saying after that. If you stick with me like a junkyard dog in a hurricane, we'll win. We'll beat this thing. And afterwards, after that trial ended, I don't know if you'd ever see this anywhere, the jury was outside on the courtroom steps, photographed hugging him, crying. It was a real spectacle, this whole thing. And then
Wow.
what does he do? What would you do, Gary, if you just pulled off that grand feat?
I would say, wow, I slicked by that one and try to start laying low for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
Not big Jimbo.
Jimbo goes bigger, and he runs for Congress.
Yeah.
And he wins and becomes the congressman in Youngstown for the next 20 years, 18 years, I believe. Wins in landslide after landslide after landslide.
Yeah.
And becomes this famous guy in Congress for his looks only got goofier as he got older because, like I said, the toupee kind of grows. His wife was a hairdresser. He always pointed it out how odd it was. But he would give these 1-minute speeches on the House floor where he would rail against anybody, the FBI, the IRS. And I'll explain that. When he became congressman, the government was they were determined to get him some way.
Yeah.
And they brought him up on a tax charge and got him in civil court, I believe, where they got him for not paying any taxes on the $163,000 the mob gave him. And he argued, again, he defended himself, and he argued, how can you bring back a bribe that was already considered, that I was acquitted for?
Yeah.
And the judge, he didn't have a jury trial this time, he just had a judge. And the judge ruled no dice. And so they actually took money out of his congressional paycheck for the next
garnished his congressional paycheck.
However many years they garnished his checks to cover that fee, whatever he owed on those taxes. And so that lit a fire under his ass against the IRS.
Yeah, I bet.
and he went against the IRS from that point forward. And he started taking on these causes in Congress that were supposed to be championing the little man against the big establishment. Yeah. And became a character and a much beloved character, not even just in Youngstown, but around the country. And it's, like I said, he's a big through line for the Mahoning Valley. He as our congressman, he was the face of Youngstown in a way, and the corrupt history of this place. And eventually they come back and get him again after they've finally toppled the mob in Youngstown. So we can get back to the mob for a second. I know you want to hear about Lenny Strollo.
Yeah, a little bit about him. So in our last episode, we talked a lot about Joey Naples and the Naples brothers. So Joey's the surviving kind of boss of the Naples brothers. He becomes a made man after the disappearance of Charlie Carabia. So throughout this whole time that the Traficant thing's happening, Joey Naples is getting rid of his competition and rising up. His boss, Briar Hill Jimmy Prado, gets old and he's on the way out. He dies of natural causes eventually at the end of the 80s. But before he does, he sponsors Joey Naples and Lenny Strollo to become made men in the Pittsburgh family, the LaRocca family. So at this time, Michael Genovese was the boss, and those guys get made in the same ceremony, okay? Now, these guys were rivals. Joey Naples and Lenny Strollo, even though they were both part of the same organized crime family,
they weren't part of the same clique and family in Youngstown. And so Lenny always kind of resented Joey was always the powerful one. He was always considered the boss, right? And he didn't think that should be because they were made at the same meeting. So these guys had a joint operation. They ran a casino at the end of the 1980s, Lenny Strollo and Joey Naples, called the All-American Club, which was one of the biggest casinos outside of Las Vegas, the biggest illegal casino outside of Las Vegas. They were pulling in $20 million a year. And it was this just nondescript, windowless building in Camel, Ohio, right outside of Youngstown, the city line. And they were pulling in big money, right? $20 million a year. They were doing this for years. So finally, the FBI busted them. And they busted Lenny Strollo. It was everything was under him. It was kind of, he was on paper as the guy running the show. Joey Naples doesn't get charged. So that bleeds even more resentment to Lenny, who from that point forward believes that Joey's working with the FBI. So a rumor gets out there that Joey Naples is an FBI informant. Lenny Strollo goes to prison for a couple of years for the All-American Club casino. While he's on his way out of prison at a halfway house in 1991, Joey Naples is assassinated. Now, this is a big deal. It's a made guy.
Yeah.
Okay? To this day, it's unsolved, and it's not known, even amongst the FBI and everything. They have suspects, but the motives and everything is still very unclear, because Lenny Strollo would deny this to the day he died, that he had anything to do with the killing of Joey Naples. Now, he might have been saying that because that's against the rules. You can't just kill another guy. There's some suspects, and we talked to him in the Crooked City podcast. We explore this topic as well. But the bottom line is Joey was gone. In 1991, Joey he's goes to this construction of his new house, this big mansion he's having built, and he had OCD, undiagnosed. He was a neat freak. People said he flossed his teeth 50 times a day. He would always show up every night, just like his older brother, Sandy, who was killed every night like clockwork, going to his girlfriend's house. Joey would go to the construction site of his new mansion every night and sweep up. He didn't like mess. And that's where they killed him. They got him a sniper from across the street in a cornfield, because he was building a mansion out in the country. A sniper puts a couple bullets in him as he's getting back into his car. And 1991. So Lenny Strollo becomes the de facto boss of Youngstown. The old man, Briar Hill Jimmy Prado, had died of natural causes. Now Lenny is the only made man in town. Okay? Ronnie Carabia is still in prison for killing Danny Green, and his other brother went missing. So now Lenny's the guy. And Pittsburgh sends one of their guys, a guy named Henry Zatola, Zebo, they called him. They sent him, the boss of Pittsburgh, sends Zebo to Youngstown to keep an eye on Lenny Strollo, because they don't know if he just killed Joey Naples. That's against the rules. You got to get permission, right, Gary?
Right. Yeah. That's a big no-no. They, they were pulling out all the stops to try to get somebody to tell them that Strollo was involved in that.
Exactly. So he goes there, and Lenny denies, and Lenny was in a halfway house when it happened, so he was just getting out of prison. But it becomes, Joey Naples' crew is now resentful of Lenny, because now suddenly it went from these guys were the bigger players, and their guy gets clipped, and now Lenny usurps them, and his group becomes these guys. So Pittsburgh, the family says, okay, Lenny's the boss. Lenny's the boss of Youngstown. This doesn't sit well with the Naples crew. And one gentleman in particular named Ernie Biandillo, who was one of Naples' most trusted guys, lets it be known that he's not going to take orders from Lenny Strollo. Well, Zebo Zatola is there to tell him, Lenny's the boss, you better fall in line. He doesn't fall in line. They kill Ernie Biandillo. And this, how they do it, is what brings Lenny Strollo down eventually. At this point, it's the 1990s. We're in the mid-90s, okay? Joey Naples died in 91. This is now 95, 96. Ernie Biondillo is gunned down on his way to work to his vending machine business. He's gunned down by a couple of drug dealers, a couple of young black guys. Mm. Lenny Strollo, at this point, had started working with young drug dealers in town. At first, he was ripping them off. Mm-hmm. These were the only guys that had any money in the 1990s. They were selling crack. They were making a lot of money in Youngstown on drugs and crack especially. And the murder rate was going through the roof on the street. So Lenny Strollo was brought this plan by one of his lieutenants, a Jewish guy named Bernard Altschuler, who was affectionately known simply as Bernie the Jew. That's his nickname. Bernie brings Lenny a plan that says, hey, we can get these guys money. We can get this drug money. They set up some gambling spots in these parts of town, and they cheat these guys with rigged dice and fast card dealers. They start making money off these guys. Then Bernie brings Lenny another plan that's, these guys are getting in trouble. They keep getting arrested. Okay. Lenny owns City Hall. He owns judges. He owns lawyers. He owns the prosecutor. He's got his hooks into everybody. They set up a racket to fix cases. Mm. And word gets out that certain amount of money, 10 grand can fix this, more for certain things, depending on what you're in trouble with. But the word gets out, and Youngstown's murder rate goes through the roof. And per capita in 1994, it was actually, I think the highest per capita in the nation. Was called Murder Town and the murder capital of the country. Mm-hmm. So this was all because Lenny, as the boss, is kind of rigging these cases and making just hand over foot with this racket. So, but he forms this kind of this unholy alliance, if you will, with these drug dealers. And they start then using these guys to do hits. And they're the ones that they have a crew that goes and kills Ernie Biondillo. But these guys are not, mob hitmen. No. They make mistakes. And so one of them in particular steals Ernie Biondillo's ring. And it's a big diamond encrusted ring with his initials, EB, in diamonds. Uh-huh. And it's a very distinct ring. Yeah. And they took this ring, and I guess Elvis Presley, right? He might have had one too, EP, but Ernie B, and they pawned it at a pawn shop in Pittsburgh. Oh man. Now talk about it actually goes unsolved though. For a little while. And until a guy named Paul Gaines decides he's going to run for prosecutor. This is a former cop turned lawyer, turned defense lawyer. Now he's heard rumors around town that you can buy cases, that the prosecutor's office is corrupt. So he runs for city prosecutor, county prosecutor here. And again, it's, one of these kind of things. Nobody expects him to win. And he actually turns down the mob's money. He says he's offered a few times. He's offered 10 grand, 20 grand, 25 grand. He says no. He keeps telling them no. He's approached at a funeral. They're trying to get him any way they can before the election. This is how it works in Youngstown. Everybody takes their money. This guy says no. And that scared the hell out of him. So now he wins. He wins the election. He becomes by 500 votes. He's the new prosecutor. This is 1996, November. He's going to take office in January, first week of January. Ohio has a law that says the only way he's not going to take office is if he's killed, because they thought about planting drugs on him, setting him up with a hooker. They tried. This is all on FBI wiretap. that they thought of all these things to do, but eventually they say, you know what, they're going to kill him. And they hire these guys, the same drug dealers and everything. The drug dealers case this guy, Paul Gaines, over the month of December. Any chance they can get, they're going to do it, but they don't do it. Everything keeps popping up. Something happened. They don't want to do it. It didn't work out. We'll do it tomorrow. So finally, they decide they'll get him at his house in the suburbs. Well, they get the bright idea that, well, we should bring a white guy in on this job because, people might think it's suspicious. These guys a couple of these black guys driving around this white neighborhood, and they didn't want to put up any red flags. So they bring a guy named Mark Bacho, who is an unstable guy in the sense that he was known for violence. He's in our podcast as well.
Oh, really?
I talked to Mark. I actually go down to the prison that he's at, and I had a few meetings. I recorded the meetings that we did. Myself and another producer on the show went down and talked to Mark a lot. He tells a lot of stories in there. Some guys that he whacked, some other things that he did. He was hired by the mob in one of the case fixing schemes, they wanted to get a delay in a trial. Okay. So they send Mark to go shoot a lawyer just to get a delay in the trial. Okay.
Talk about an extreme need for a continuance.
Yeah. So, and
Your
he does
Honor, may I have a continuance?
and he does it. So they bring him on to kill the prosecutor elect. Okay. It's all of December they spent casing this guy. They're like, oh, they're running out of time. Christmas Eve, 1996. They finally have him at the house. And it's an unbelievable story, Gary.
That is. God, a guy. I mean, I've never heard anything like this. I have never, ever. I've read a lot of mob stories and know a lot of mob stories, but I've never heard of anything like this. The crusading prosecutor, and they got him at his house on Christmas Eve.
So he survived because the story gets weirder. Mark Bacho breaks into the house. That comes in through the garage, which was open. Paul Gaines left it open to let his cats out for the night. And he lived alone, was a bachelor. Mark Bacho comes into the house with the gun, .357 Magnum, holds it up. Paul Gaines tells us it was the biggest gun he'd ever seen in his life.
I can imagine, yes.
He has his phone in his hand. He's shot. The bullet goes through the caller ID, knocks the phone line out, goes through his arm, goes through his rib, drops down. Mark Bacho goes over top of him and is now holding the gun over to his face, and the gun jams.
Oh, God.
It won't work.
Yeah.
They didn't try the guns out before. They were using speed loaders, all kinds of stuff they didn't even need, really. And the gun jams, and Mark panics a little bit. And he tells us in the podcast in that moment, he's thinking, what am I even doing here? And he said he wanted to point the gun to his head and go, but he just turned around and ran. And he gets in the car with these guys, these some of the drug dealers. One of them who needs Paul Gaines to die so that he'll get his case fixed. Yeah. Okay. He says, did you do it? And Mark says, yeah, I think so. And they said, well, what do you mean? And he says, with the gun jammed. They said, well, why didn't you go back in get a steak knife and slit his throat? By that point, they'd already heard on the police scanner that the cops are coming.
They're on the way, yeah.
Paul Gaines pulled a cell phone out and called 911. And he survives, and he takes office. And for months, nobody knows who did this. He doesn't believe that the mob did it. He doesn't believe it. Until one night he gets a phone call from an ex-girlfriend of one of these drug dealers who was fed up with her guy and says, I know who shot you, and tells her the whole story about how they killed Ernie B. and Dillo. They all passed around his ring. She tells him where they pawned it, and her testimony was the beginning of all those drug dealers then get arrested, and they all flip, and they start flipping on corrupt lawyers and judges, and over 80 city officials get indicted. Okay, in Youngstown. This is the end of the 90s. This is 1998 now. It's all come crashing down. A century's worth of corruption all comes crashing down. And eventually they get Lenny Strollo's brother to flip. And the judge tells us in the podcast that their mother was still alive. And it was her decision that she didn't want one son testifying against another son. And that is supposedly why Lenny Strollo then agreed to cooperate. And he turns, and by this point, almost everyone up the chain
has flipped, yeah.
So there's only 3 guys left. It's Lenny Strollo, Bernie the Jew, and Jeffrey Riddle, one of the head black drug dealer.
Oh, okay.
Who would tell people that he was going to be the first black man made into the mob. He would say he was the Black John Gotti.
Yep.
And so it's these 3 guys left, and then Lenny flips, and against his childhood friend Bernie Altshuler. And those are the only 2 guys. There's one more guy, Lance Turnage, another drug dealer. 3 guys, 2 black guys and a Jewish guy, are the only ones that go down in the whole thing. They're the ones that get the life sentences for the mob, taking down the mob in Youngstown. Jeffrey Riddle says, you'll hear him in the podcast, after he's found guilty, he says, "Do you believe this?" He says, he says that two brothers and an old Jewish man are the ones. They're making it look like we're the mob, and so Lenny cuts the deal of a century. He gets to keep all of his money, all of his millions, and his estates and all that. He serves, I believe, 12 years, bouncing around, going in protective custody.
Yeah,
he was back in Youngstown a lot. People said it was a running joke for a long time when he was supposedly locked up. I just saw Lenny down at the thing, down at the bowling alley or whatever. And he eventually gets out. He lived. We talked to him. We tried to get him for Crooked City, and he passed away right when we were kind of in those negotiations with him to get him to sit down and talk with us. He died in 2021. Mm-hmm. So, just it was when he gets flips, and it's all, the mob crumbles at that point. Like I said, that was really the end of the mob in Youngstown, the end of the 90s up to 2000. And then the FBI, they turned their attention back on Jim Traficant, our congressman.
Yeah.
And they got him again for racketeering. They indicted him again for racketeering, bribery, all that stuff. And again, he defends himself in court. This time he's got a jury trial. The judge this time around would not let him have any jurors from Youngstown. So when that happened, it was over. Unfortunately, he went out. His defense did not work this time, and he was found guilty, sentenced to 8 years, I believe, and he did almost the entire thing. And I got
federal time. If you got 8 year sentence, you got to do about 7.
He did it, and just the end of an amazing, unbelievable, movie-worthy life.
Really.
Like I said, as a character goes, you couldn't write this stuff.
Really. Need to make a mini series out of this. Hey, one of those extended HBO series on this thing. That would be great.
I brought something for you too. While Jimbo was in prison, he took up painting. I have a few of the original Jim Traficant artwork. He loved his horses. He got in trouble. Some of the bribes he got in trouble for were taking money for his horse farm. Lots of favors on his horse farm. Here's an Elvis Presley.
Cool. Yeah, he's pretty good.
and his skills got better as he was there. And he liked his women. He had a lot of these. This one he wrote on the back, "The Preacher's Daughter," he called it.
He had a sense of humor, man.
Oh yeah. So, just a fascinating character. He goes away in 2002, I believe. I was in high school, and he ends up serving all that time. He gets out. He was going to run again for Congress. Finally, the public didn't vote for him.
Yeah.
And he ended up dying in 2014 on his farm in a tractor accident. That's how we kick off the Crooked City podcast. He dies in a tractor accident. And if you ask anybody in Youngstown, it's a 50-50 chance you might get somebody say, "Oh no, it was the feds were responsible for that one." Men in Black.
Men in Black. Yeah. Well, that sounds familiar in this day and age, but
yeah.
Well, this has been great. Johnny, I really appreciate you coming on. Now, what else you been doing? What else you got going?
Oh, I appreciate it, Gary. I started, so I spent a year working with Mark Smerling and his company on this podcast, Crooked City. You can check that out anywhere there's podcasts. But I just launched my own company, Amazing Podcast Company. I'm working with mutual acquaintance of ours, Rick Perello.
Oh yeah, he's a good guy. I've had him on a couple of times.
Yeah, we're working on a show called The Vice Squad that kind of explores a lot of the earlier days of some of these guys. And I made a documentary about Youngstown about 10 years ago. It's up on YouTube now. It's Youngstown Still Standing. Somebody wanted to get more information, they could check that out. And the last thing is we started a group on Facebook called Youngstown Mob. And we've grown up to 23,000 people.
Wow.
Youngstown Mob. So there's a lot of people from Youngstown share stories, pictures, files. It's a really great resource for people like me, a historian, journalist, filmmaker. It's been great. And a lot of folks have been reaching out to us on that site, the Facebook group. So you can find me on there. My YouTube channel is Amazing Podcast Company. So it's just youtube.com/Amazing Podcast Company. Please, check us out. We got videos. We're always talking mob stuff and true crime and working on some cool stuff.
All right, cool. I just tried to join the Youngstown Mob. I found it, but I can't join it as a page. I got to flip over to I'm a page and myself.
I feel you. I feel you, Gary. I got my own page. When you start working in true crime, you can get some characters reach out and, maybe from behind bars or wherever.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I created a page like you did.
Yeah.
And the page is Johnny Cetchelli on Facebook. But that's long enough to spell. My personal thing on there with that Youngstown Mob group is Johnny Consigliere. And I'll be sure to, if you send a request on there, we'll be sure to add you.
I'll get on there. I've got to go back and change that up. So anyhow, all right, Johnny, I really appreciate you coming on. Again, these have been great stories. My wiretappers, we call them wiretappers, fans of the podcast. Many of them are my friends anymore. I've made a lot of friends over the last 4 or 5 years. And there are a bunch of good guys out there, and they're going to eat this thing up, and they're all going to be.
I'm a wiretapper too, just to let you know.
All right,
guys, I'm one of you. I've been listening to Gary for a long time.
Well, good. All right, folks, don't forget to watch out for motorcycles when you're out there. I like to ride a motorcycle, and I do not want to get hit by your inattention, and that can happen. If you have a problem, if you like you got a problem or a friend of yours has any problems with PTSD and they're a vet, be sure and go to the Veterans Administration website and get that hotline. And again, thanks a lot, Johnny. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much, Gary.
All right.
Much, Gary.
All right.
Much, Gary.
All right.
Much, Gary.
All right.
Much, Gary.
All right.